Hello, everyone. This is the second recording for Early Stoic Philosophy, a class on Stoic logic, physics, and ethics. And today I want to offer a topical introduction to Stoic logic. Logic here is a somewhat more capacious field than logic today. It does include something like what today we call logic, but it also includes philosophy of language, epistemology, and a few other things. And today we talk about a topic in epistemology, namely so-called kataleptic impressions. The Greek is kataleptike, and literally translated, a kataleptic impression is an impression that grasps or captures how things are. So the Stoics propose, and that is one of their real innovations in epistemology, they propose that there are impressions, mental representations of something being a certain way, which capture things as they are, and this is an important second clause here, and they reveal to the cognizer that this is what they are doing. So the cognitive impression, as this is often translated, and as Long and Sedley, whose edition of fragments we use, they translate cognitive impression. I'm going to say kataleptic impression. The cognitive impression in their translation reveals how things are, and it reveals that it is a cognitive impression. Now, this second clause is so important because the kataleptic or cognitive impression is supposed to be a criterion of truth. That is another technical term, and it means that you can use that which is the criterion of truth as a standard or measure, in Greek canon, which literally means a yardstick. You can use these impressions like a yardstick in order to measure whether other impressions that you have should be accepted. So the Stoics propose that there are these impressions called kataleptic, which capture how the world is and tell you that this is what they are doing. And their opponents, the skeptics, say, well, not so fast. How are we going to distinguish these impressions from other impressions? And couldn't it be the case that someone has a kataleptic impression, but it is indistinguishable from a non-kataleptic impression? And the debate that ensues between skeptics and Stoics, is a multi-argument, multi-step, multi-generation discussion. On your handout, you have a kind of reconstruction of all, many of the moves, not all of them. It is not clear that we can reconstruct a kind of relative chronology. There are many hurdles to that, also because it is not clear that it's a kind of standard assumption that whenever the skeptics raise another objection, then the Stoics add another qualification. And so the Stoic definition of the kataleptic impression on that way of thinking would get longer, because the skeptics, always push the Stoics to add another qualifier. But it is, in fact, not the case that the Stoics kind of drop the shorter definitions, sort of as this debate goes on. So it is not quite clear that this is how we should be thinking about it. But either way, this discussion is very contested among scholars, and it is a kind of tough case for those of us who like the Stoics, because it is quite conceivable that in that debate, the skeptics win. There is, however, another kind of dimension to this, where I would argue that the Stoics win. And not just with respect to their immediate interlocutors, academic skeptics, skeptics in Plato's Academy, but sort of more long-term, because they create a framework in the philosophy of mind, which proves to be very powerful. And so what I want to do now, rather than sort of try and trace some of the steps in this discussion between Stoics and skeptics, is to talk about this framework. The most basic component in this framework is the very notion that I've already used of an impression. The Stoics think that the human soul is thoroughly and entirely reason. That is a rich and complicated idea that we are going to explore in many dimensions throughout the semester. One thing that it means is that they do not distinguish between what today we might call the perceptual subsystem of the mind and the cognitive subsystem. Those would be our terms. Instead, for them, when you perceive something, that is already intertwined and permeated by cognition. So, for example, they would argue that if you look at something that is green, then it is not the case that kind of the green color affects you and somehow causes you to have the perception this is green. Rather, they would say that you actively form the thought this is green. And this thought is conceptual. You work with, employ the concepts, this and green, and actively form the thought, this is green. So even something that sounds like a mere perception, as one might put it, this is green, for the Stoics is a thought. And that is actually one of their biggest claims, that all human impressions are what they call rational impressions. And what that means is that all representations in the human mind are conceptual in the sense that I just described. They are actively formed thoughts. And in addition, that means that such an impression as this is green has a linguistic correlate, which is the sentence, this is green. So this is, as it were, the kind of basic coinage of what is going on in the human mind. That is what the Stoics propose. And then they propose that we respond to these impressions with assenting to them or rejecting them or suspending judgment on them. And you can see, if you know a little bit about ancient skepticism and sort of that the ancient skeptics say they suspend judgment, you can see that the skeptical position or the skeptical, they do not have, of course, a philosophical position in the sense of a philosophical view that they defend, but you can see that the skeptical approach in philosophy can only be formulated within this framework in the philosophy of mind, where you have kind of something seeming to you a certain way, and then you either accept it as true, and that is what is assent, or you reject it, not taking it to be true, that is the next option, or you suspend judgment on it. And that is what the skeptics say they do. So they actually formulate their own approach in terms of the framework and the philosophy of mind that the Stoics create. And then in that framework, the discussion continues on whether this idea that there are kataleptic impressions is compelling. Now, I want to leave you with one question about kataleptic impressions, which is a tricky and difficult question and quite contested in the scholarship. So there is a bit of recent work on this that I think really changes the discussion about kataleptic impressions. Namely, the question of whether you think that the further distinction which the Stoics introduced between expert and non-expert impressions, whether you think that that should somehow inform what we take kataleptic impressions to be. So just a word about that. The Stoics think, and that kind of deepens the point that I just made about cognition and perception, they think that an expert perceives the world differently from a non-expert. So for example, if you are a painter, then you're going to maybe not perceive green, but moss green. So you immediately kind of bring to bear a more refined, sophisticated conceptual apparatus when you see green. It's not like the painter and the non-painter first have the same perception, and then the painter kind of in addition thinks, oh, this is moss green. Rather, the painter, according to the Stoics, perceives moss green, sort of immediately perceives the world in the more refined conceptual terms that are available to her. So it is a difficult question, and that is sort of what I would like to invite you to think about, whether all cataleptic impressions are expert impressions.